I'm going to read their bios. Everybody sent me a long bio. I'm going to read them because it's important. First, and they're also, I'm going to read them in alphabetical order. So the first up is Mr. Darius Dennis. Darius is a commercial sign and mural painter that hangs from the sides of buildings nationwide while creating realistic advertising campaigns by brush. In addition to advertising, Darius operates his own large-scale mural studio, Big Wall Sign and Mural, where he strategizes the execution of community and neighborhood murals that support beautification in the name of equity and various humanitarian issues. In the past 5 years, Darius was working as a commercial sign painter, which services a majority of the top 20 luxury brands in the country. Separately, Darius's personal mural achievements have been recognized on multiple occasions by the New York Times, WTTW, NPR, and other national news sources. Darius's personal work continues to push the envelope between mural and monument, beacon of the past or sign of the times. Darius is always attempting to use the medium of painting as a powerful device that not only changes our perception of space, but attempts to embrace our spirit in a gentle manner. Recently, Darius has achieved this goal by blurring the lines in visual and educational tools, sign painting, and activism, by using paintings to create safe spaces for thinking, teaching, and feeling. Darius intends to help keep big wall paintings relevant in cities all over the world. Next, we have Mr. Vashon Jordan. Vashon Jordan is a you're still 24? Still 24. Okay. 24-year-old visual artist, born and raised on the south side of Chicago, Illinois. A graduate of Kennedy King College and Columbia College, Chicago, he uses photography and videography to showcase authentic stories and moments that reflect the people of Chicago. Vashon enjoys engaging with youth across the city to inspire and encourage them to follow their dreams. He was a photography intern for the Chicago Public Schools from 2018 through 2021, with a summer internship with the Chicago Mayor's Office in 2018. Jordan joined the Chicago Tribune as a staff photographer intern for the summer of 2021, then worked as a staff photographer at JB for Governor, and currently works as the director of digital media and photography at the Office of Governor JB Pritzker. From the moment he picked up a camera, Vashon has used it as a tool to uplift the stories and beauty of Chicago. In 2020, he captured over 17,000 photographs at dozens of protests across Chicago, using his lens to shine a light on the joy and community found in demonstrations. And he often ventured to places where news cameras did not follow. After the summer of 2020, Jordan self-published a photo book entitled Chicago Protests, A Joyful Revolution, to ensure that those stories were forever documented properly. The Chicago History Museum acquired his book and photographs of the 2020 protests for its research center and collections, and his work was included in an art exhibition at the Elmhurst Art Museum and Museum of Science and Industry, and is currently available in over a dozen Chicago public libraries. Over the last 2 years, he has captured aerial photos of Chicago, which often gain significant traction on social media, showing parts of Chicago in a new light. Vashon was recently named the 2023 Artist of the Year by Choose Chicago and is featured on the first ever Forbes 30 Under 30 Global Chicago list. Diana Solís, who is joining us virtually, maybe we'll see her in just a second, is a Mexican-born visual artist, photographer, and educator whose work includes photography, painting, illustration, printmaking, comics, public murals, and installation. She is inspired by Mexican and Chicano culture, memory, cautionary tales, oral and personal histories, queer identities, and narratives. Her work examines notions of place, identity, and belonging. Hybridization and the convergence between humans and nature are recurring themes in her paintings and illustrations. Central to Solís' practice is her commitment to being a teaching artist and sharing her knowledge and process in collaboration with youth, immigrant families, and adults to engage and support them in creating art from their point of view. As a teaching artist for 4 decades, Solís has taught students of diverse backgrounds and ages in a wide range of settings that include community organizations, public schools, museums, and special residency programs. Recent projects in photography include working with students at the Nico Juarez Community Academy to create a series of works related to the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on their lives. Solís has several exhibitions of her photography scheduled, including Images on Which to Build, which will travel to the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, Ohio, and the Leslie Lohman Museum in New York City in 2023. And she is joining us today from New York, right? Welcome. And last but certainly not least, Maggie Tokuda-Hall is an American author of children's and young adult novels. Tokuda-Hall was born in 1984 to American television journalist Wendy Tokuda and television producer Richard Hall. They received a Bachelor of Arts in Studio Art from Scripps College and a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from the University of San Francisco. Maggie is joining us from Oakland, California. She is the author of Also an Octopus, The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea, Squad, and Love in the Library, which I think she'll be discussing a little bit today. In April 2023, Scholastic's Education Division proposed obtaining the rights to publish the picture book for inclusion in a collection called Amplifying Anabi, Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. The collection is part of the Rising Voices Library, which curates books along with teaching materials for educators, aiming to offer students engaging texts that highlight the narratives of historically marginalized groups. To be included in the library, Scholastic requested Tokuda-Hall remove the phrase "virulent racism" from a sentence in the author's note, discussing the traumatic impact of anti-Japanese American policies, and to delete a paragraph addressing the broader historical repercussions of racism in America. Tokuda-Hall declined the opportunity to be included in the Rising Voices Library, refusing to alter her book and its message. Scholastic later apologized and requested a meeting with Tokuda-Hall to discuss including her book in the library. Although Tokuda-Hall initially denied requests for a meeting, she met with Scholastic.
That's not true.
Oh.
Oh, no.
In May 2020.
I actually was really excited to meet with them. I'm never sure where that information came from. Please continue.
All right, sorry. She has stated that she's received many hate messages regarding the book, as well as.
I'm sorry?
You stated that you have received many hate messages regarding the book, as well as many emails against the promotion of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So please welcome Maggie Tokuda-Hall. So maybe we could just go in the order, in that alphabetical order, and have everybody do a little presentation, and then we'll come back and have discussion. Yeah. Jennifer, could you share the slides for Mr. Dennis?
Nice. I think it's probably going to be hard for me to tell what the order is, but what we have up in order right now is just a few examples of some of the murals that we completed that I was able to work on organizing and completing in 2020. The long short story, right? I gotta keep it quick. Is that everybody knows 2020 was a pretty like damaging, demoralizing year in lots of ways. You know, from everyone being locked down and confined in their homes, limited on being able to do business or interact with their families. I personally ended up being an essential worker in 2020 because I was an out-of-home advertising painter. Sounds crazy, but I was essential because in New York at the time, New York's legislation had decided that if anything continued to get worse in the United States, that not only would commercial media as far as television and everything be affected, but if they needed to give out COVID information to the general public, that they would need sign painters to be included in the essential services. It was crazy. We traveled the entire year, we flew the entire year. We did not shelter in place. The 40 people that I worked with based out of New York worked the whole time. However, that did spin the company that I was working for at the time, that did spin them into this conversation of what they were doing corporately as far as diversity, equity, and inclusion, as many different corporations had to adjust to. They had to decide what they were doing as far as the diversity of their workers and their employees. Everyone had to take a look internally and decide whether or not they were being equitable, or if they were trying at all to help what was going on with civil unrest and justice with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many, many, many other people. The company I worked for at the time got canceled. They got canceled, they got taken through the ringer for lots of good reasons, is my belief. To the point to where myself and then 3 other friends, I made a phone call to Chicago and I said, we're going to Chicago whether or not anybody likes it or not, and we're going to paint about what's going on. So in May, at the end of May, we started watching the board ups go up in Chicago. The first week of June, we went and painted this wall white in Wicker Park. The previous wall was in Wicker Park, and we painted the I Am a Man piece as a response to the civil unrest and what was going on in the country. So as a device, what we did was we looked at the past, how to bring the past into the present to have discussions about where we are right now. The election of the use for top photographs was pretty strategic in the sense of over the past few years in art. And I know that my friends that are photographers can attest to it. There was definitely a complicated conversation going on between what it meant to be a photographer taking photos of artwork and monetizing them. And at the exact same time, what it meant to be an artist and to be either, copy and pasting or, modifying and altering photographic images in order to monetize them on the other end. Bob Edelman, who took this photo of the I Am a Man, which this I Am a Man photo is from the memorial of Martin Luther King, if you don't know. Some people believe that the I Am a Man protest of it was about workers' rights, right? Some people believe that this was one of the marches that led to so much unrest under King's, order and leadership, that it's one of the things that may have had him killed, right? Fast forward, we paint this piece because we know we want to leave something in the community that's permanent. We didn't want the board ups, we knew the board ups were coming down. There's no other way to say it. As soon as the Apple Store on North Avenue and Clybourne boarded up, we knew it was going to come back down. And we watched the neighborhoods and we watched everyone in the community and communities nationwide start to paint about the topic on the board ups. Integration is real. There's no other way to say it. So we decided to leave something that we would be able to look back on and say, hey, this is from that moment, but then to dig deeper and say it's a problem that persists from an even further moment ago. Bob Edelman was not with us, but it took us to go paint a portrait that we painted on the DMV in Louisville, Kentucky, shortly after. We painted Danny Lyons' image of the Great March on Washington. When we painted the Great March on Washington, if you give me the next slide, let me take a look. There's one, so this one is, this piece I'm talking about is right before this one. When we go to paint the Great March on Washington, the irony there is that, no, it's fine, you can leave it. But the Great March on Washington, when we painted in Louisville, Kentucky, I don't think I have a slide of it up. But when we showed up to Kentucky, if you remember, bands protesting in the streets. They banned protesting in the streets. You couldn't march in the streets. They banned it. We touched the ground and we painted a protest photo on the DMV. That was our response to that. So we got into this conversation of what does a silent protest look like. We got into this conversation of how many different ways there are to protest. That was the thing, right? That took us to what was the previous image, which is John Lewis. When we paint the Great March on Washington, we get in contact with Danny Lyon. Danny Lyon, at the time when we painted the Great March on Washington, leading up to paint John Lewis, was infamous for not giving people license to paint and use his images. Infamous, because so many people have tried to monetize his work over the years. When we make the relationship with him, when I made the relationship with Danny, we find out Danny has a huge Chicago connection. He's a UIC guy. You know, he was in Bernie Sanders' class. He grew up in Uptown. I'm sorry, raised his family in Uptown. His New York and Chicago relationship, my Chicago to New York relationship, really, really put our personalities together, even though generationally, you know, we're very different. But our experiences in life, the radical art of that man, it's really beautiful. He grants us permission to paint the DMV, and he was John Lewis's best friend. So if you watch his documentary, there's all these last moments in John Lewis's life where he's there with him. John Lewis specifically requests for Danny to be there by his side to document the end of his life. He was his best friend. We get granted this opportunity to go to Rochester, New York to paint John Lewis. It's wild. Danny really wanted to do it. He didn't know he wanted to do it, but we placed the photo in a building in a mock-up, and he's like, oh my God, that's it. Rochester's history, I can't do it all in a couple minutes, but Rochester's history is tied to Frederick Douglass. It's a stop on the railroad, you know, the Underground Railroad. We get there and it turns out that the owner of this building has the historical features which support that this was a stop on the Underground Railroad and that this is across the street from where Frederick Douglass gives the "What to a Slave is 4th of July" speech. Wow. We did not know what we were getting into at all when we painted this, and we found out after we started. Well, Frederick Douglass we knew, the stop we didn't. We paint John Lewis. John Lewis is his friends, his family, his sorority. The nun that saves John Lewis from bleeding to death on Pettit Bridge. They're in Rochester. You know? So we ended up painting something that was significant to Danny's career and his life without fully understanding until we were painting it what it meant to that community. The next slide takes us back to Chicago, where we, after painting John Lewis, you know, personally being from here, this will always be my home. This will always be my love. This will always be my city of choice. I may live in many other cities at the same time, but this is always going to be it. This is the core for me. In this series, what we did is we went through, let's do 4 paintings. The gentleman who I worked with on the other 3 paintings before returning to Chicago, all super talented, and when I talk about super talented, I'm talking about all of African descents. 2 of the individuals, Dominican. Some of the strongest Dominican power players you'll ever meet in the hand painted out on signage. And then Ephraim Gray his family's from Eritrea. When we arrived at 3 paintings being completed, we got to return to Chicago. I said we had to return to Chicago in order to paint the painting in Uptown that's behind me now. It took 2 years in order to organize and execute, to fund, to put 2 swing stages on the building, to hang off the side of the building for 2 weeks. And then I switched out the crew. It was the moment with which we had to make a decision to not be the gatekeepers that we've seen of commercials past. We had to bring in the greatest living Mexican sign painter. We had to bring in his student. So Esteban Sanchez is probably the greatest living out of home billboard sign mural painter that there is. He's 67, 68 years old. He works harder than anybody I've ever met, and he doesn't know how to put the brush down. He just doesn't. He's incapable of not working. He's incapable of not shining. He's incapable of not painting better than me. He's in Cape. But his student turned out to be a gentleman named Patrick McGregor. Patrick McGregor is arguably the greatest living American sign painter of his generation. And he's taught by Esteban Sanchez, who leaves Mexico at the age of, he leaves Mexico and hops the border at 18 to go to LA to paint the rock and roll billboard era of everybody. The Beatles, you name Richard Pryor, he painted the Sunset Strip. And he came to Chicago in order to be on this wall with us. Patrick comes to be on this wall with us as well. And then Jasper Patch, who is notably one of the greatest out of the East Coast, living wall dogs. He's pretty much the backbone of what is Colossal Media and Sky Murals and all of the other commercial billboard companies he came to. And that diversity group built this. We put 2 swing stages on it, painted it for 2 weeks. And that is the last piece in this 4-part series. We can probably breeze through the next couple so that I don't take too much longer. This is Rochester, New York. This is the last time, this is when I talked to you all first. So when we did the Zoom call and I was like, oh, I'm in Kentucky. I'm sorry, it was Louisville, Kentucky, not Rochester, New York. When I was in Kentucky and we talked, this was the painting I was working on. This is not part of that 4-part series. It is a la carte. This is the very first day of the protest in Frankfort, Kentucky for Rihanna. The name of it is Twan's Gift. Twan came to be a part of this when we finished it. Muhammad Ali's wife was present when we finished it. The mayor of Kentucky graciously came and spoke, and this was about, we did all these things about the past, and then we were looking for contemporary photographers, which it's fortunate and it's unfortunate, right, that we couldn't find Black and brown photographers from the eras that we were looking at and make contact with them. They exist, but the contact was an issue. So we ran into this, well, how do we start to bring in, a diverse body of people behind the photographs? And this photograph was taken by Jonathan Cherry, who is now Getting Images. Jonathan Cherry, who, when we met him and he took our first photos, he had just started taking photographs. He was brand new. And now he's a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer. He's like the spirit of Louisville, Kentucky's photography. So we got to watch him grow through his experience with protest photography. This next image, that's the very first image that John ever took for us when he started his career. That's Henrietta Helm. That's in Louisville, Kentucky. Henrietta Helm is the very first woman from slavery to become a teacher in Kentucky. So she leaves, long short story about her, she leaves, she is free from slavery, she becomes a teacher, she later becomes a principal. She teaches out of her home until the day she dies, her whole life. She gives back to the community, she teaches night school. It was painted in Women's Month, in respect for women in teaching. And also, it's a la carte from that 4-part series. It's illuminated, there's a light on it. But yeah, go ahead and go to the next one. And then these are just a couple examples about, I'm glad in the bio that it does mention trying to take the commercial and then trying to have this conversation about the community. How do we take, my whole goal for the past couple of years is how do we take the luxury, right? If you follow Virgil Abloh's work, rest in peace from Off-White, the brand Off-White and Nike. Virgil does this thing where he starts talking about black space. And if you went to the exhibit, you might have seen it. They built that house that he designed and they carried it across America, black space. And if you read about the black space thing, for him, he talks about how when things are for, and I'm gonna be frank, I think this is the way he says it, when things are built for white space, corporate space, the elite space, All the bells and whistles, all the paint, all the screws and bolts are tight. Perfection is what it seeks. He makes this point that if it's not that, usually it is not built to perfection. Black space in corporate America is not built to perfection. It's sort of just an add-on. It's sort of just a throw-in. It's sort of just a, oh, but we need to fulfill it. We watch it in politicians. We watch it in television. We watch it every single day of our lives. And I'll be frank when I say it. The immigrant population that is coming into the bigger cities like Chicago need all of the support, and they deserve it at an elite level. It doesn't need to be a throwaway or a shoe-in, right? It doesn't need to just be an acclamation. We can try harder, is the point, right? So that's what I've been on. How do we take the best materials in the commercial sign industry? How do we take the biggest spaces, the stuff that you can see from blocks and miles away, and how do we make them permanently implanted in the community world, such that we even get into an argument about whether or not it is museum quality, you know? In LA, the biggest wall that I've painted in LA, it's 14 stories high, it's near the Staples Center, and it's about $250,000 a month. When we start to talk about our histories, is all I want my work to do is to give it the class with which everyone can say, hey, you know, it's an asset. Even beyond it being invaluable, we need like property managers, we need community members, we need leaders to say, hey, you know, if you take this away, you know, this is basically robbing us, this is taken from us. So, you know, that's the explanation of the project that like brought, I think, some of you all to see the piece on Wilson. And yeah, the short explanation of like the caliber with which the organization that I'm running is trying to bring community level art to a place where it has stature amongst the rest of the art. That's what.
All right. One of our panelists, Maggie, may need to move to leave a little bit earlier, so we're going to ask Maggie if she can go next, if that's okay.
I appreciate it. Thank you. That was so wonderful. And I thank you so much for shuffling me up. I have my son's parent-teacher conference to get to in a little bit, so I just want to make sure I'm there for him as well. Are my slides available, or should I just? Oh, great. Awesome. So like my introduction said, I'm the author of Love in the Library. I write for children and young adults. For my entire career, I've been a children's bookseller. I've been involved in children's publishing since I graduated college, and just really fell in love with it and fell in love with the opportunity to speak directly to kids who I think are both really elastic and brilliant readers, but also people who are completely unpretentious about what they like. And that was why I love them so much as an audience. Could you change to the next slide, please? Love in the Library is the true story of my maternal grandparents who met in a Japanese incarceration camp called Minidoka during World War II. My grandmother, Tama, was the camp librarian, and every day my grandfather, George, would go in and check out huge stacks of books he had zero intention of reading so that he could go flirt with her. The game worked. They got married. They had their first child in Minidoka. Could you go to the next slide? And, you know, our family was born in this kind of under this backdrop of virulent and really abhorrent racism. If you go to the next slide. So like in my introduction, as mentioned, this is Love in the Library was published by Candlewick Press, which is a small and really wonderful press based in Massachusetts that does great work. Like they publish the Where's Waldo books, and I Want My Hat Back, a lot of books that you probably recognize and seen, but they're not a publisher like Scholastic. Scholastic has this really unique place in the market, which is that not only are they a publisher of children's books, but they also have direct relationships with something like 90% of public and private schools in the United States, which means that their reach among educators is incredibly unique, and their responsibility within the education market is also unique. And so this April, they made me the offer to license my book, Love in the Library, which basically just means they were going to take it, repackage it as a scholastic book, and make it available with curriculum guides for their teachers, which is a great opportunity. And I want to be clear, it's not a guarantee for success. The way I've been explaining it is kind of like getting placement in some place like Walmart, where you're like, it doesn't mean you're going to sell anything, but it means your visibility increases a ton. And for books particularly, that competition for space is really fierce, and that competition among authors of marginalized backgrounds is even more fierce and even more for even more limited of space. But if you could go to the next slide, this is the edit that was demanded in order for me to take that licensing deal. And there's an entire paragraph that was really essential to me for communicating about this book to children, which is that what happened to my grandparents wasn't an isolated incident in American history, and that we are not the only people to suffer mass incarceration because of what we look like or who we were. And it was so important to me to communicate that, because when I was a kid, I know I wondered what was wrong with us as Japanese American people. What was wrong with us? Why did our country hate us? And it was because I didn't understand this incredible tapestry of history that my family was a part of, in which we were not the only people who had been, this kind of crime had been done to. And in fact, we were part of this huge group of powerful people. And when we cheat children out of the opportunity to understand the context for their suffering, but not the consequences of their marginalization, we only compound their experienced pain. And so it was really important to me to make sure that kids who read this story, whether they're Japanese or not, understood that this was not unique. This wasn't a special weird moment in history. And I worked with my publisher to do things like make sure that when we were advertising this book, we never used the language in a dark time in American history, because it is all American history that is this way. And so this whole paragraph that you see lined out is a paragraph situating what had happened to my grandparents within the context of American history. And I would say it was a really modest nod to what I am talking about in terms of space and time, but it was really important for me to me for that to be there. They wanted that entire thing cut. But not only that, they also wanted me to cut any mention of the word racism from the text altogether. I'm not a scientist or a historian, but I am pretty sure it is impossible to tell the story of Japanese American incarceration without using the word racism. And so I made the decision to say no, and I made the decision to say no publicly. Publishing is a lot like many other industries in that it's deeply personal. Our relationships are a lot of how our success is made. And so people are really reluctant to ever take a stand publicly about something that they have experienced. But I want to assure you that I was aware in this moment that I was not the only author who had been asked these kinds of things. But I was aware that I am an author with an incredible amount of privilege. I have a family that would be able to support me through this emotionally and also financially if this tanked my career. I have, I'm married to somebody who is the more prominent breadwinner in our family. And so if my career tanked and I needed to start over, I understood that that was a risk I could afford to take. I also knew that I know this industry incredibly well, and I knew where the pressure points were in a way that a lot of authors don't necessarily. I've worked in basically every possible position in this industry. And so I felt confident that I would be able to communicate about what had happened in a way that was succinct and effective. And I hoped that when I did that, that other marginalized authors would then have conversations with their editors and agents about discussions that, or things that had been asked of them that were not appropriate, or that they didn't feel comfortable with, or that they wanted to take a harder stand about. I kind of thought that this would be an intra-community discussion within children's literature, but I think by merit of being in a package that the mainstream media found appealing, which is to say I am cisgender and I am not Black, they were willing to talk to me in a way that they were not willing to talk to lots of other authors who have faced the exact same thing and have spoken about the exact same kind of treatment. And so I understood that I was standing in for a lot of people who are not usually invited into the room. And the reason I interrupted during my introduction to say, oh no, I was actually perfectly willing to meet with Scholastic, and I am not sure where that information originated from, although I've seen it a lot, is because I did understand I was standing in for so many people and I wanted to meet with Scholastic. And I had 3 goals for that meeting. And it was, I wanted to know how this had happened, because in their initial statements, they said it was against company policy. So I was like, well, I would like an explanation for how that happened. I wanted to know what they were going to make sure that what they were going to do to make sure that this never happened to another marginalized author who they did business with ever again. And I wanted to know what they were doing to combat book bans, because that's ultimately what this was about. Scholastic was trying to thread this kind of impossible needle of saying, you know, oh, we treasure diverse voices and it matters so much to our publishing program to lift every voice, etc. While at the same time making their books safe for the very kind of people who would see people like me silenced and or dead. And I did not accept that. So when I went into that meeting, which I was very eager to have, those were my goals. I thought they were pretty modest, but not a single one of those goals were met. Firstly, the editor who made the offer was not invited to the meeting, which I understand. They didn't know what kind of person I am. They didn't know if I would become abusive or yell at them. I understand protecting their employee. But I did expect somebody who was present in the meeting to be able to speak to what had happened. For what they were going to do to make sure this never happened again, they gave an answer that on its face sounds acceptable, which is that they were going to hire outside auditors to come into the company to tell them what had gone wrong, which sounds nice, except for about 14 years ago, there was a book called Love You Bunches by Lauren Miracle that the Scholastic's book fair group tried to offer a licensing deal. And they said, we can license this book if you take out the gay parents. And at the time, Lauren went public just like I did. There was an uproar just like there was with me. And they said, oh my gosh, we're so sorry. We're hiring an outside auditor to see what happened and to tell us what went wrong to make sure that this never happens again. So obviously that answer was bullshit. Excuse me. And lastly, what they were doing to combat book bans was the most disappointing answer. I want to be clear that Scholastic is not a mom and pop operation. They're a billion-dollar corporation with reach into 90% of schools in the country. This is not, you know, somebody with a shoestring budget. Their CEO makes $3 million a year. This is not, you know, an independent bookstore just trying their best to make their way in Alabama. This is a huge corporation. So I said, what are you doing? And I was really excited for the answers. But the answer was that they provide annotations. And I asked them what that meant. And they said, basically, the good press a book receives. They provide that to educators who are dealing with these kinds of things. The good press a book receives might be like, oh, NPR said this was one of the best books of the year, or the New York Times said this about a book. And for context, that information is always available on a book's Amazon landing page. It is available on the author's website. It takes about 10 minutes for any given title to collate all the good press that book has gotten. It is not the resource of a billion-dollar company. And so, because I understood I was standing in for all these other people, I said no again. And I said it in that meeting, and I was very pleased to be able to say that then, because I know not many of us get a chance to speak directly to CEOs of companies like Scholastic and tell them that they need to do better and that we demand them that they do better. I communicated to them that I did not think they were up to the responsibility of licensing a story like my grandparents' story, which does not exist in isolation and has to be told with solidarity to other marginalized people in American history, or not told at all. If you could go to the next slide. And I get asked a lot if Scholastic learned anything. But in the last 2 weeks, it's become abundantly clear that no, they absolutely did not. They have created a separate bookcase in their book fair program called Celebrating Every Voice, which is an incredibly ironic title for a collection of diverse books that feature titles about Justice Ketanji Brown or John Lewis, that schools now have the option to opt out of diverse titles. I am of the mind that all rising totalitarianism is dependent upon people who make compromises before they are even asked to make them. Fear is an incredibly effective way to keep people controlled, and institutions that preemptively capitulate are not just being cowards, they are actively aiding and abetting the rise of, in this moment, a uniquely American fascism. And so if this is something that bothers you, I highly recommend reaching out to Scholastic, who are available on every social media platform, and letting them know how you feel. It's not much, it's not the biggest thing that's happening in our world right now, but if you are interested in how children are taught about history, and you think that the largest publisher in our country has an obligation to tell that honestly, I do recommend holding Scholastic accountable. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Vashon, would you like to go next? Or Deanna? Deanna, would you like to go next?
Maggie, thank you for what you said and what you've done. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, I could go next, if that's okay. So unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, these titles are in Spanish, but I will translate. So a little bit about my history as a photographer, visual artist, but mainly in photography, as I began doing photographs since 1976. But in the late 1990s, I left photography, almost 20 years, and then returned back to photography in 2020.
You cannot fully hear your audio.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I guess it was low. So I'm going to primarily talk about my photography.
Great.
And as I've been working as a photographer since 1976. And in 1990s, in the early 90s, mid 90s, I left photography. And it was to pursue painting and illustration. And I returned to photography during the pandemic in 2020. So I'd like to show you some of the work I've done in the context of this panel and discussion. And these are subjects, as Maggie had brought up, and also the first gentleman, that we are still grappling with. The things that we've been struggling and fighting for many years, for various rights, for against racism, gentrification, from other issues, social issues that affect our community all over the United States. So we can go on to the next slide. So a lot of my work, I did a lot of documentary, and I was a photojournalist. I used to work as a stringer for the Tribune, and then later started for the West Side Times, Learner Booster News. And then I went to Mexico. A lot of my work focuses on LGBTQ and queer community members today, including the Latino community, and particularly Pilsen, where I'm from. I hear a lot of noise. Is that something going on back there? I'm sorry. Very hard for me to talk above the noise. I hear things falling. Can you hear me?
It's going in and out.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. It was very hard to talk over the noise. So can we just go back to the first slide, please? Okay. Can you hear me? I'm not hearing anything. Are people hearing me talk?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So this image is from 1982, Mexico City, Gay and Lesbian March at the time. And I was traveling between Mexico and Chicago, photographing gay and lesbian movement on both sides of the border. And we'll go on to the next image. You can go on to. So in Chicago in 1983, I worked a lot with some of the community organizers and people like Rudy Lozano and others, and students at the University of Illinois. I was able to do a lot of photography at that time, and one of them was about Rudy Lozano and his assassination during the time. This is before I left for Mexico. And this is an image from a march that was done right after his funeral in Little Village, and people marched down Cermak Avenue. A lot of my interest is what people do to create change and social change within their communities and beyond through either protest or art. And so this particular image was about Woody, and you could see the banner in the background, and the person in the photograph is this young man with the dark glasses wearing a lot of badges and buttons about Rudy and his union organization. We can go on to the next one. Again, a lot of my interest was in what was happening also in Latin America, in relationship to the United States and immigration. And here, this was a demonstration downtown about the US out of Central America. And this is around 1982. Again, you'll see a number of people here, and including union organizers and the banners and flags from different groups that were here at this demonstration and supporting the idea of the United States out of Central America, which has been going on for a long time. We know that since 1973 and before, during the Allende years and the coup that subsequently ousted Allende's government and brought upon a reign of terror to the people, artists, and musicians in that country. As a result of that, many had left Chile and were refugees in other countries, including the US and Mexico City. We can go on. Again, here I'm looking at and working with, collaborating with women in Mexico. One of the biggest things and main interests that I have is working on women's issues and with different women's groups. While in Mexico City during this time before and 1987, I was attending a series of conferences, women's conferences, and gatherings that happen every 2 years called the Encuentro Feminista Latinoamericano y del Caribe, which is women coming from all over Latin America to discuss the situation on women, femicides, and the conditions of their countries with respect to women. And this was, to me, a very, a night photograph, a night shot. And what surprised me the most was to see this young girl who is basically someone who works selling chicles or gum in streets in Mexico City. And she joined the march and picked up one of the little candles in solidarity with the women. As you can see, even though it's at nighttime shot, you'll see the faces. Some of them, they're using the symbol of the women's symbol, double symbol. So again, these marches were incredibly important. This one was a Take Back the Night march and to fight against violence against women in 1987. And as we know today, the femicides have only increased, and we have many organizations today fighting to end the violence against women, and not just in Mexico, but in all parts of the world. Go on to the next. This is a little earlier. I don't know if I had these all in order, but I attended the very first march, national march, gay and lesbian march on Washington, D.C. in 1979. I was a student at the University of Illinois, and a friend and I decided to go to the march to support, and also it was around the time that I came out as a queer person in this country. And so this was one of the images that I took during that time in Washington, D.C., about women in prison, and many of the groups there. I had met the group from Mexico City, El FAR, which was the National Front for Homosexual Rights, and they were instrumental in creating a large groups of for the first gay pride parades in Mexico City. I met them later and worked with them in Mexico City in the 80s. We can go on to the next image. These are images that are juxtaposed. The one on the furthest left is Gay Pride in Mexico City in 1982, and the others in the 1990s here in Chicago. And the rallies, as you can see, the two figures, and then the woman dancing, the people dancing, and the rallies after the marches. So a lot of my work, I would consider it to be, at that time in particular, because my work is different now, my photography work, and I focus more on portraiture and documentary portraits within the community. I consider that work to be transnational, going back and forth between each country, and literally sort of putting these two, the developments of the movements side by side. You can go on to the next slide. Casaslan, I grew up in Pilsen in Chicago, of Mexican parents. I was born in Mexico and raised in Chicago. My interest in photography began when I was 11 years old, through the magazines Life and Look magazine and National Geographic. A lot of the photographs I did are of the community and of events and people that I know living in Pilsen. And this was taken outside of the now defunct Casaslan, which are fancy apartments now, bought by a developer due to gentrification in Pilsen. And these were youth workers, summer youth workers, in front of the Casaslan Cultural Center in Chicago in 1987. I don't know if you're leaving questions for later, but I guess it might be best. So also from 86 to 87, I received a fellowship from the University of Illinois, the graduate school, to create a series, to do an essay, and I worked on a series of mothers and daughters in Pilsen and photographed many. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Someone's knocking at the door here and I can't answer. As I was saying, I worked on a essay on mothers and daughters and intergenerational relationships between mothers and daughters. And my interest was in, again, many of the people I photographed, the women, were neighbors and friends, including my own mother, my sister, and others. And this work was over a summer, with the fellowship was for a summer. And I was able to really get to know a lot of the women in my community and the thoughts behind them and their relationship with their daughters and mothers vis-a-vis, also including many of them did not speak English at the time. So I was able to, because I'm bilingual, was able to communicate and record some of their talks and experiences and ideas behind this project. We can go on to the next slide. I didn't do my timers, and somebody can remind me of the 10 minutes. I tend to go on. So fast forward to more recent work. I'm now working on a project on kinship and chosen family. And it is a project that deals with the Latinx, Latino LGBTQ community, primarily in Pilsen, but also community members that are not LGBTQ, and examining and working with and collaborating with people on the idea of kinship in its many forms. Yeah, I'll look at that later. You're in the chat. This is a photograph from that series called Con Orgullo, with Pride, and a young man who happens to be the son of friends, who's a jazz pianist now. And this was taken at the club where he was working. And again, one of my interests in doing portraiture, and I've always done portraiture, but now more than ever, is the idea of how we see one another, especially between that space of the photographer and the subject. And in this case, I think that for me, what's most important is to try to photograph people the way they would like to be seen, as opposed to the way that I would like them to be. Again, I do give some direction in the work when working with some of the people in my photograph, but it is mostly up to them how they would like to be seen. I have a lot of discussion, and I also allow them to photograph me as well.
Deanna, we have 2 minutes left.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just quickly, some of the photographs I've done in the past in portraiture include Trent Atkins, C.C. Hunt, who were instrumental in Thing magazine in Chicago, and of course, Sandra Cisneros, the writer. But I'm going to leave it at that. And again, thank you for having me here, and I'll be glad to answer any questions and talk about my work.
Thank you, Deanna. Vashon, would you like to present?
Hello. I just feel like we attended 3 master classes. That was fantastic. Just give one more round of applause for the previous. I know we're a little bit on time, so I'm going to be cognizant of that. I want to do a quick reintroduction. It's been about 50 minutes since we've done that introduction. So I'll do a quick reintroduction, then we can show that video. Then I have a few thoughts and notes that I've written down since being here. But my name is Vashon Jordan Jr., 24-year-old photographer, visual artist, born and raised here in Chicago, from the south side of the city. Just some of the overarching resume stuff I'll just go through now, because this is not the complete subject we want to talk about today. My parents both have pretty conflicting stories about how I started photography, because as I do more and more, they're like, I'm the one that did it. I can't remember. Everyone like has their story of how they were the reason for all this. So I've taken all that and kind of narrowed it down to what I think the truth is. But I thought I was using disposable cameras, and it just reminds me of some of the film photography that we just saw. Before I picked up like a cell phone camera or any type of camera, with your phones today, you can take 100 photos, and then you go back and you pick the best shot. But with disposable cameras and what we're just looking at on the screen in the presentation, you have a very limited amount of photos you can take. When you're working on these huge surfaces, you mess up, you don't have another, all right, if I mess this up, let me just go to another building. You have to, work with what you have in those confines. And that kind of started my grounding in photography, where I knew that I needed to focus on what the moment is, because as a elementary school student, I would take my disposable camera on field trips. I would have 27 shots. I'm like, if I want a photo of my friend, you're not wasting all my film. So you're getting 1 shot, maybe 2 shots, but I have to think about, do I want you smiling, do I want you in a serious face, do I want you inside, outside, all of those things I think about in the forefront. And that kind of led my grounding and foundation in photography. I went to Brooks High School on the south side of Chicago in Roseland, where I served as a school photographer, graduated in 2017, and started an internship, which was the first of its kind with Chicago Public Schools, where as a full-time student at Kennedy King College, which is one of the city colleges of Chicago, I was serving as a photographer for the entire school district. At the time, CPS was the 3rd largest district in the entire country. Anyone CPS grads? So you guys know like the calendars that come out every year with the photos and stuff like that. Like that was one of the projects that I worked on, and like provided photos for following a CEO around, doing sport games, and just all those types of stuff. And then during one of the summers of my first year, I also did a photography internship at the mayor's office. 2020 happened, did some work that summer that I'll play as a video, and then after that, I landed an internship with the Chicago Tribune, where I spent 3 months in the summer of 2021 going around the city, taking photos of the Trib. From there, I was offered a job on Governor Pritzker, Lieutenant Governor Stratton's re-election campaign, where I spent 14 months traveling the state on their winning re-election. And currently, I'm in a brand new role where I serve as the Director of Digital Media and Photography at the Governor's Office. Other freelance stuff, accolades and awards that I won't spend time on, but I have a video, if we can have that ready, that ABC7 Chicago did a story about my work in 2020. And this is a much more succinct way of describing all of this, so I'll just let that do the talking.
Hold on.
Over the summer of 2020, I captured over 17,000 images. Everyone has something they can contribute. For me, it was photography. I wanted to go out and use my gifts to make sure that I put a stamp on history and mark this period of time. The year of 2020 was one like no other. I photographed looting, but I also photographed positive events. I photographed Trump rallies, police rallies, everything that was going on. I made sure I gave them equal coverage and I showed everyone. There are moments out here where I captured things that no news cameras capture. Black history and the Black experience is magical, and I wanted to make sure that that was held longer than a news cycle. I believe that no one can tell your story better than you can. So as a Black man covering these uprisings and these events that are happening to Black people, I'm able to convey this in a way that many others can't because I live this experience, I know it innately. I captured over 17,000 images and I put them together in a self-published book entitled Chicago Protest, A Joyful Revolution. With the book, people are able to see these images in a tangible form. Having items in the tangible form allows you to realize that this is real. I noticed that for people, it's hard to believe a Black story if you can't physically see it on paper. I wanted to make sure that I'm coming out here and I'm showing it to you. As we drove around the city, we came across this location and it struck me. Coming back here today, it looks very similar to how it looked when I first photographed it. But for this to sit here, it brings down the morale of the neighborhood. To drive by and see this store burn down reminds you of that time. And it's traumatic, and it's one that shows that there is no investment in this community. So to see it here is really disheartening. I wanted to make sure that we had moments where people are happy, smiling, dancing, and love, because that is revolutionary as well. I took one of my favorite photos of here of protesters doing a swag surf right here on this intersection. But I just remember that day of being here and that energy, that swag surf. I was getting photos and video at the same time. I was swag surfing a little bit too, and it was an all-around great moment. On June 6th, I covered the Chicago March of Justice. There were 38,000 people as far as the eye can see, filling the streets, so many different races, background, classes, creeds, and genders coming together to proclaim that Black Lives Matter and stand up for something. To see a photo of a Black man showing emotions and showing feelings is something that you don't see often, and I felt that that was one of the things that we really needed to blast out. We need to show that Black men do have feelings and emotions too. Black people are human. So I wanted to put our humanity back by showing him that emotional embrace. In the future, I want young Black boys and girls to see that people who came before them fought for them to be where they are today. For me, covering protests has opened my eyes to the work that we need to do to make a better tomorrow and succeed. We have to understand that it's going to take all of us to save us, and we have to come together in order to move forward as a nation.
Slowly but surely trying to get over that uncomfortable feeling of hearing your voice on camera. It's like, oh, why did I say that? Fix your shirt, dude. Okay, so as I was listening to the earlier presentations, I had a few thoughts that I was writing down, kind of just about like what is driving the work. And I think this kind of connects to the reason why I assume you all are taking time out to be here today. And one of the biggest things, we talked about this earlier, was the idea of permanence and erasure of Black history and Black identity, and what we're doing about keeping that in place. For me, when the protests happen, not just as someone who's from Chicago, loves Chicago, I'm always out taking pictures. So protest is a part of the fabric of the city. And when I went out to cover the first protest, I was just doing what I normally do. I didn't have like some type of big bright idea in the beginning to do the book, or it was just, this protest happening, I'm going out here, I'm covering it. And I think one aspect is everybody has something to contribute. And we are living in a time where we're not that far removed from all the ills of society. We're still creating new ills today, that everybody has to contribute in your own way to advance society, advance the movements, and kind of the reason and the entire theme of what this event is about. So I realized very early on that what I wanted to see is not what was being represented in the news media. But I'm the kind of guy who's like, if you want something to write, do it yourself, and be the change you want to see. So it didn't take me that long to see that the news coverage wasn't properly reflective of the joy and the beauty that I was seeing out there, for me to say, I'll just do it myself, right? I don't have to wait for some news station. I'm not gonna waste my time, writing them a nasty tweet or, placing a phone call to someone who doesn't have the power. I'm gonna just go ahead and do it myself. And that ultimately led to all the stuff that happened here. Has anyone in the room ever been to a protest, by a show of hands? Now, so you guys, correct me if I'm wrong, because you guys know, usually protests are demonized on the news, on TV. They're dangerous, they're violent, everybody's looting, everybody's just a criminal, right? But then some of the most beautiful spaces that I've been at have been protests. And they're so organized, with the street medics that are out there, and the bike marshals that are out there, and the folks in the front with the megaphones keeping people together, folks passing out the mutual aid. And the title of the book is Chicago Protest, A Joyful Revolution, because after I took the 17,000 photos and attended the dozens of protests, I was like, what's the through line? What is the thing in here that I found that every protest had in common? And it was joy. And the cover of my book was from a protest on the west side of Chicago that received no news coverage. We were in a loop, and there was, threats of police violence. Everybody named Mom was out there covering that. This kind of stuff on the west side, there was no violence happening. No one really cared about that. And that's the idea of if it bleeds, it leads. Working at the Tribune, I know firsthand what it's like working in news. And just a quick note about that, the 3 months that I was there, they told us, the entire staff at a staff meeting, what our objectives were as journalists, what our North Star was every day we go out and do our job. The North Star was not to get the proper story. The North Star was to keep subscriptions. The North Star was the money. The North Star was people were buying newspapers, wanted to keep buying newspapers. What do we need to show them for them to keep buying? And I thought, when I just took a step back, I was like, we're protesting the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. There was nothing peaceful about those deaths. We're talking about murder in cold blood. And the response is we're dancing on the street. I mean, if you think about we're responding to, these senseless killings, you can say, by dancing in the street, it almost I describe one of these a modern day sit-in. And the idea of Black joy being revolutionary in itself. So one of the things that led me to really make the book was the idea of who tells our history, who tells our story, because when I donated this book to the Chicago History Museum, one fact that they gave me that I wasn't really proud about was that this book was the first and only artifact from the 2020 protests in the History Museum. And I thought, how is it possible that all this can happen in 2020 in Chicago and around the world, and there's no one here who really feels the need to put a piece of this in the History Museum, in the history books. And then from there, it led to being in 16 Chicago libraries and different schools and teachers that invited me to speak. and are showing this in their classrooms. And I really found that idea of like realizing that everybody has the power within yourself. You have to do a little bit of extra work, but to find what it is that you do best, how you can contribute and maybe work with others, and community is so important, and bringing these ideas to the forefront. Because when someone said I should make a book, I was like, that's a lot of work, I don't really know, and being a publishing company and all this and all that. I tried to reach out to a few companies and they were like, no. They're like, you either don't have enough money to put up front to buy all that we need, and we don't think you're gonna make that much money off this book. No, thank you, we don't really have the time. So I was like, all right, I'll do it myself. Anybody want to guess what software I used to put this book together? Canva, any other guesses what software I used? Adobe, Google Slides. Google Slides. The font is called Anti, but please don't go Google it in my book. But this is the same thing that you just saw up here, and I self-published the book through Kindle Direct Publishing, which is owned by Amazon. Literally put this together, Google Slideshow, sent it to my friends, helped me review the book, uploaded the manuscript, and now it's available on Amazon, self-published, right? But you guys are so surprised because we think that it's such a hard thing to get into, and sometimes that fear prevents us from even trying. So what I try to do with my work, which is show people that we all have the collective power to tell our own stories, change our narratives. When I was covering the protest, I would tell you there was not one news outlet who really cared about the work that I was doing. I was just using my social media. I gained over 10,000 Twitter followers in 2 weeks. Just from people following my work and being like, I like what this guy's talking about. But also being responsible to the community, because like one of the questions people ask me a lot is like, were you scared going to the protest? And it's like, people knew who I was. Because when I was out there tweeting what was going on, there was somebody in that protest who was looking at my tweets. And there were a couple moments where I tweeted some things and someone came to me right then and there, and had some thoughts about it. But it's like the community knew what I was doing, and that gave me the access to go forth and get the access that I was getting to cover the protest. I'm not sure if you guys all were in Chicago in 2020, but there was an incident where this guy in the dreadhead cowboy rode his horse on the day ride. Mm-hmm. Some of you guys familiar with that? Yeah. Okay, so you guys all heard about that, but did you guys hear about the 2 marches that he held before that?
Only later, only much later.
That's the problem, right?
Yes.
He held 2 marches in the community peacefully. He had his horses out on the street. He was giving horseback rides, free food, dance competitions. They even had dance groups parading on the south and the west side. No news outlet was there for the first one. The second one, only Black Love Chicago showed up. Nobody cared. The same mission, the same reason he was on the expressway. Nobody was there. I was there, but no news outlet was there. So when he rode his horse on the day ride, guess what he called first? Me. And that's in the book too. Like I have photos from the first 2 in here, but he called me. And I was the only person there, media-wise, who covered that. And I was with him. I probably should have criminalized myself, but I helped him like strategize, like how we should shut the lanes down to make sure that it was safe. He just wanted to go and just march right on the expressway and just bring it to a halt. And I was like, that's gonna be a pile up, it's very dangerous. Get on one lane, he had bikers with him, and then, take a lane and slow it down. But I was literally, it was like a movie. It was another supporter he had there, she was driving me around. We were ahead of him, she's driving me, we pull over, I jump out on the expressway, I'm literally down there taking these pictures, I jump back in the car, we're speeding ahead of them. But that made international news. Literally the BBC and the Middle East reached out for the footage. But the problem that I had was like, why do we have to do that to be heard? Why does it take all that for you to believe a Black story and a Black issue? And that was what I was doing with my media, and that led me to like the Tribune and now the governor's office, using my role to do what I can to advance the mission. But really the idea of like that self-sustainability, leaning on community, and leaning on ourselves to kind of tell our stories, but also that community support, couldn't happen without people in the community amplifying the work that I was doing. I think I made that succinct enough to make it right on time.
You were very.
All right.
I want to say that I'm one of your followers as well.
We are waiting for the provost of the university to come and give some closing remarks in a couple of minutes, but I think we have a moment or two for questions, maybe.
Maybe Maggie first, and she has to go.
Yes, if people have questions for Maggie, since I think she may also be already in another meeting, we're not sure.
She's already, okay.
But would anyone like to ask a question?
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm picking up on something that Dr. Ferguson actually talked about with the student earlier, which is a question around, Dr. Ferguson's talk earlier today was about reading and reading as a revolutionary act. And the question was about literacy and how to think about literacy. And as I was watching the images, both the images of the books, the images that were on, that are these massive, beautiful murals, the photography over many years, the stories you're telling about, the way you translated these photographs to different media spaces. I just wondered if y'all could talk a little bit about this question of multiple ways of reading meaning and how your visual art helps to convey meaning in ways that are different than text, and why, often in association with text, but not always, and how that dynamic works, and why is it important for us to have that dynamic in the world?
Well, I think that it's important to have the visual access to things that are not always text. I think that text allows us to put things into context in ways that perhaps an image does not. Images are wonderful and they can be very impactful, but they can also be taken out of context and used by different forms or forces or people or governments to give someone the illusion that, see, this is what's happening. And in fact, we see that today in terms of the news, always, and today, especially with what's happening in Gaza, when you see an image of someone throwing something, automatically it will be given a label, but not necessarily by the people themselves, but others. And I think Vashon knows very well what news out there, how that is changed and misconstrued often. So I think in my case, I was not there on assignment photographing images during those times in the 70s and 90s, 80s and 90s. It was part of what I did as part of my life as an active participant in these different movements. But at the same time, I believe that those images are historic to a large extent. And so I believe that images in itself are very important to help people along in order for them to also tell a story that they see that is happening through the image.
Thank you.
If I can add on to that, something that, myself and friends that have painted with me considered greatly was the tact to treat the general public with a certain amount of respect for their intelligence. Commercial media, the way that Deanna just spoke to, uses very deliberately, right? They use words and buzzwords and catchphrases to make us do everything from byproducts to maneuver through this world in the mainstream, if you will. And for us, it was like, okay, well, and for me specifically, as a business person, there's this conversation of what is a sign and what is art. Like I have to go through it daily. Is it a sign or is it art? Is it advertising someone's business or is it meant for everyone to be able to use their own sensibilities and digest it the way that naturally, the way that they live, right? And that's something that I have watched very deliberately in how we approach certain paintings. If the piece that you all saw in Wilson, there's not a single word in it unless it actually existed, unless it was like the Tower House or someone's button for revolution, that existed. But to try to manipulate how it makes you feel is not the goal. Like, it's more about, you know, the snapshot of time, the energy of the people present, the colors and things that are involved.
I have a few thoughts, but just to make sure I'm getting the direct question, it was about why image is important.
Well, and how they help us convey meaning in ways that text may not be able to.
Yeah, I think part of it is we live in such a digital age now. I'm going to say this and look away from the faculty.
I don't really want to read that much.
Now I go back to the room. But like, I mean, the conflict that's happening, like Israel and Gaza. To be honest with you, what I've been looking at more is like photographers on the ground and like looking through their Instagram, looking at the videos, looking at the news clips. I've read an article, but there's so many articles I'm not really gonna sit and read it. Because everything is like the device, everything's the technology. But the problem is like, as artists, we have to attack in all realms and spaces. When I was covering the protest on social media, it was getting some really good reach. There's a video, there's a way on Twitter where if a person tweets a video, you can make a tweet and embed their video in your tweet. So the views still go back to their page and everything. And I had a video up with some protesters celebrating like the Columbus statue was coming down, and some like right winger made a tweet talking about people weren't wearing masks. And at the time, President Trump was in office. He retweeted that tweet. So with the power of like just using social media, I'm filming something on the ground in Chicago. The President of the United States literally just watched. However, when I put it in the book, a lot of things happened. One, for some reason, I don't know, people believed it more when they like physically had it in their face. Some of the stories that I can tell you from 2020, like with the gray cow, we probably would not believe unless we had like a photo of it. The other aspect was it was able to reach audiences who may not have been on social media, who will look at a coffee table book, or your grandmother who may not have a Twitter account, but you can show the book and have everything there. And then the other thing too was I realized that the longevity of it was needed, because at the time, like, yeah, it's viral, like, how social media works. An hour from now, something else is trending. And I'm like, even today, no one is going back on social media looking for what people were saying in 2020. It's only news articles, only if you Google what happened in 2020 that you're seeing it. And even in like an academic setting, we're looking at like what's going on in the physical textbooks that you're getting. So I think it's important in that aspect of like kind of permeating the different ways that people receive information. And then also just still having the longevity of having it on paper, which I obviously, banning books is working against that. I'm so ready to put on and the governor, Pritzker, he did all these things, but I always lie, so I'll talk about these are good things.
I'll throw one, like if I can, another log on that fire, which is historically speaking, we know it works. Like the last time books got banned, we watched everything from like the church through almost all sections of humanity realize that artistry or the visual communication will substantially still teach, right? It's like you don't need to, read the whole thing, or if your literacy level is, has not, put you proficient to reading about it, then at least you can see it, you can justify it. Historically, humanity knows it works.
Yeah, and with the book and that same idea, one of the other things I realized too is that people have to be willing to accept the truth. And I think like one of the big problems that we have in society today is everybody has their own truth. Like this is fact, and we have opinions, like everybody has their own, this is what I think is true, this is what I think is true. And in 2020, when I was out on the ground, I had thoughts. And I was putting out what I thought. But in the book, I made a decision to keep it objective in the sense that it's just the photos and then all of the captions are news-like captions. The name of the person, whatever they're in, what day it is, what's happening. I deliberately wanted to keep out any of my opinions. The other thing I did that a lot of people were thrown off about was I didn't just cover like Black Lives Matter related protests, I also covered Blue Lives Matter protests. I went to two of them specifically, covered them the same way that I would anybody else, and I put that in the book. And the purpose was I wanted to say, I believe this because of what I saw, I'm gonna give that to you. Take this Black Lives Matter protest, take this Blue Lives Matter protest, you look at the diversity of the protests. You look at the anger in people's faces. You look at who's dancing in the street and who's shouting and putting out hateful messages, right? And if you're willing to accept the truth, maybe, you will see what I see, an idea. And that's why I was so comfortable with saying like a joyful revolution, even though it starts off with looting, because when you look at the whole picture, you kind of get the idea, if you're willing to accept what the reality is.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thanks to all of our panelists. I'm sorry, I feel like we have to temporarily cut the conversation short because we have comments from our university provost coming up, but hopefully we can continue the conversation and the reception in just a few moments. But thank you all for participating.
You ready?
I think so, yes.
Really, the interesting conversations have been the conversations that have been happening all day long, not the few ending remarks that I'm going to be saying here today. But I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for the conversations, for the viewpoints that you have exchanged today, because they truly exemplify what a university is all about. More importantly, they exemplify what DePaul is all about. Because the purpose of education is not to only answer questions, it's to pose questions, to understand how little we know. The more education I received, the more ignorant I felt I was. And I think it's very important, not how much we learn, but how we learn to ask the question. Let me tell you a little secret about faculty for the students here. Faculty realized when they were in college how much they loved college, and that's why they became faculty. Because for them, was a way to keep on learning. And I witnessed it today in the undergraduate student presentations when, make sure I got their names right, when I looked at how the faculty engaged with Crystal and Samara and Gabriel and Jael and Lazio and Lila, they were eating up the information, the ideas you were giving them. So thank you to the students who have really collaborated today. But whenever we have conversations, we have to remember that there's always a fundamental truth. And that is, we have to ensure the freedom of expression and scholarly autonomy. These are extremely important tenets that are the essence of intellectual discovery. Because our campus is not just a collection of buildings. It is a space where intellectual expression and civil discourse can flourish and should flourish. And we need to make sure it continues to do so. We really champion the right to disagree. And we need to learn to be able to accept the disagreement, the different ways of looking at things. And our university should be and should always remain a refuge for intellectual expression, a safe haven where the invisible can become visible. Because if we don't do that at a university, where else will we be able to do it? We have a moral obligation to do so. Sometimes we don't get it right, but it doesn't mean the intent isn't there to make that happen. The world is marked by division. We're seeing it today with everything happening. As I was walking here, there were protests happening around campus. But we need to be able to hear the other. We need to be able to engage in civil discourse, where these differences are not something that we want to avoid, not something where we want to shun, but push away, but rather to celebrate them and engage with them. Because it is through those civil discourse, it's through that civil discourse that we will find the common ground, where we will bridge those gaps, where we will foster understanding. And it almost seems like an elusive goal, but we always have to be heading towards that North Star. It doesn't mean we're always going to achieve it, and sometimes our achievements are small and very incremental, but don't lose sight of that. We have to always resist attempts to erase history, to change history, to ban books. We can't allow that in our society. And there are a lot of counter forces that happen to do that, and we have to keep on pushing. So as you leave the symposium and you go for your, I don't know if you can call it happy hour. It's not a happy hour.
Sure it is.
We have undergrads here.
It's a reception.
It's a reception, thank you. Thursdays was the day for happy hour. But really, let us always remember that intellectual expression, civil discourse, is something that should never, ever not be on the forefront of what we think. Because we need to live in a society where every story is respected and every individual has to be valued. And we know, and we've seen it over and over again, where there are individuals, there are people who are not as valued as others. And we have a job to do that. And I felt really, I was telling Margaret earlier today, when I was watching the discussions that were happening with the undergraduate presentations, I said, you know what, we're okay. As somebody from the older generation, I can go, the world is gonna be okay. They're gonna take over and they're gonna do great. Yep. So don't forget that. And again, thank you for everything, and thank you for all that you do, not only for DePaul, but for the world. Thank you.